channel Elimika Mtandaoni. We are proceeding with a series of videos on open source software adoption for healthcare organizations. In this video, we will explain about open source development. But before starting the whole video, let us first get the meaning of open source development. As we say, open source development is the process by which open source, and in this case, speaking of open source or any other software whose source code can be publicly available, is developed, and it is developed by an open source project. So there are kinds of development of open source and non-open source developments. As the pioneer for this, Eric S. Raymond, provided a distinction difference between the two kinds of software. He talked about two models of software development in open source. The first one is cathedral model, and another one is Bazar model. Cathedral model software development actually is a conventional closed source development. It's a conventional closed source development. This kind of development, according to Raymond, is like building a cathedral. So as you are building a cathedral, you start with central planning, then there is tight organization, and one process always there is a start and there is finish of a certain process. So the cathedral model, in which Raymond said the source code is also available, just like development as we know in open source software development. The source code is available, but with each release of a software, there is a release of soft code. But the problem here is the code that is developed and it is the one that is released, its development is restricted, and it is only exclusive to a certain group of software development. That means development using cathedral model, the team or the people that are involved in the development are the one that will see the release of such codes. So the development there that is existing between is only restricted to such a group of software developers. But we have another model in which the code that is being developed, it is over the internet and it is viewed by the whole public. So it is open and it follows the law of Linus Torvalds that said, if given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. As this statement means that the more widely the source codes are available to the public for testing, for scrutiny, for experimentation, then it is more rapidly that the forms of bugs that will be in that source code will be discovered. This has been emphasized much more in the Bazar model by another pioneer of open source who is called Gregor Robos. Gregor suggested that for a software to be using Bazar model, it should exhibit a number of patterns. It should exhibit a number of patterns. And the first pattern is, it says that users should be treated as co-developers. Users should be treated as co-developers. What does this mean? This means that users should have access to source code of the software. And furthermore, users are encouraged to submit additions to the software code fixes, for the software bug reports, for documentations, etc., etc. So users become part of the software development and they are encouraged to submit whatever they want to the software as additions, or if they see some code fixes, they are allowed to show code fixes, and they should be able to report bugs. So having more co-developers, as you know, having more co-developers, this increases the rate at which the software can evolve. as we have previously said in the Linus law that states given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. That means that if many users view the source code, then they will eventually find all bugs, and hence they will suggest how to fix them. So that is very important according to Gregor Roberts, that users should be treated as co-developers. That means they should be able to submit their additions. They should be able to report some bugs. They should be able to show code fixes and to involve themselves in documentation and etc. So that is one of the patterns where Gregor Robles talked about Bazar model. Another pattern, early releases. Uh, in software development using Bazar model, the first version of the software should be released as early as possible. Why should you release your software as early as possible? It is so that you can increase one's chances of finding co-developers easily. Remember that we need co-developers in open source development using Bazar model. You cannot be just yourself as a developer. You need users as co-developers. So the earlier you release the first version, the earlier you will get the users, and hence you will get co-developers. Another pattern that should be exhibited by Bazar model is a frequent integration. Speaking of frequent integration, once a code changes, then should be integrated. Integrated means that they should be merged into a shared code base. And this should be done as often as possible so that to avoid what we call overhead of fixing a large number of bugs at the end of the project life cycle. So the early release, then it should be followed by the frequent integration, and that frequent integration should be done as often as possible so that in the end we shouldn't have a lot of bugs to fix in the project life cycle. Some open source projects have gone further. They have built what we call automatic integration, and integration is done on daily basis. So it is very important, if you are adopting or you are using or you are exhibiting Bazar model, to have frequent integration of source codes. Then we have several versions as another pattern in Bazar model. Speaking of several versions, that means that there should be at least two versions of a software. You have to have two versions of a software. The first version is a buggier version, and this buggier version, most of the times it has more features, and hence and it has more features, a lot of features. Speaking of features, we have a software can do a lot. But these buggier versions, we also call it development versions. It is meant for users who want an immediate use of the latest features. So it will have a lot of features, and you give them to users, and they will be willing to accept the risk that is associated with using such features. And remember that because it is a buggier version, then it is not yet thoroughly tested. So the users can then act as co-developers to report any bugs or to provide what we call bug fixes. Another version, as we have said that you need to have several versions, another version will be produced is a stable version, and this stable version won't have many features. It will have few features as possible, simply because most of the features have already been would have already been checked for bugs that have been reported by the core developers, that are the users. Then another pattern is there should be high modularization. High modularization. We say that the general structure of the software should be in modular form that will allow parallel development on independent components. You should not develop a software as a single thing. You should have some modules. So the first module, the second module, the third module having many modules will allow co-developers to deal with the different modules parallel. So it allows what we call parallel development on independent components. Another important pattern, as Gregor Rebos says, is a dynamic decision-making structure. There is a need for decision-making structure, whether it is formal or it is informal. That makes strategic decisions depending on changing user requirements and other factors. So to have dynamic decision making allows to make strategic decisions, and these strategic decisions will affect the changing user requirements, and it will affect some other factors. So after we have understood that different models in developing an open source software, now let's see starting how we can start our open source project. There are several ways of which we can develop, or we can start developing, or we can start an open source project. Starting an open source project depend on different ways. The first way is an individual can have a need to have a software project. So that individual who senses that there is a need to have a project, he or she announces his or her intent to develop a project in public. So he says that I have this idea, I want to develop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in public, and the idea is public. So volunteers will come up and contribute in the development of such open source project. So that is one way which we can develop an open source project. Another one is there is a developer working on a limited but a working code base. Then after working on the code base, he releases it to the public as the first version, the buggier version of that open source project. And from there, the users that we call the co-developers will contribute on improving that version. So that is another way where a developer releases a source code to the public for users to contribute. Another way is if there is a source code of a mature project, it has been developed for a number of years or for a number of months or days, then that mature project is released to the public. So for public to add some additions, or to see some bugs, or to report any bugs. That is another way. Another important way is if there is a well-established open source project that can be forked by an interested outside part. So there is an established project, open source project, then interested parts can join in and contribute to that interesting project. But you have to note something. To start a successful project, in order to start a successful project, it is very important to investigate what is already there. It's very important to investigate what is already there. That means the process should start with a choice between the adopting of existing project or starting a new project from scratch. You shouldn't just go out there and start a new project without investigating what is already there. If a new project is started, then the process goes to the initial phase, and it will take a lot of time. But if there is an existing project and it has the same idea as the one that you plan to develop, then you can adopt that existing project and you can go directly to the execution phase and develop that software. But there are different there are a number of types of open source projects. There are a number of types of open source projects. Speaking of open source projects, can be you can develop what you call libraries. Libraries, these consist of standalone pieces of codes, and some of these might even be dependent on other open source projects. You develop the libraries. If you have ever developed using C++. There are some libraries such as include IOSTD. Such libraries can be developed as open source projects too. These projects serve a specified purpose, and in fact they fill a definite need. For example, an example of this type of project include Linux kernel. It was developed through libraries. We have Firefox web browser and even the LibreOffice suite of tools. It is also one project that is a library project. We have another type of open source project that is distributions. Speaking of distributions, these are collections of software that are published from the same source within a common purpose. They are produced or they are published from the same source. So it's a collection of software. You start with one software, then a number of softwares can be produced from that common the same source. For example, we have a number of software operating system distributions. There are many Linux distributions. We know that we have Linux such as Linux Debian, we have Linux Fedora, we have Linux Madriva, we have Slackware, we have Ubuntu, we have a lot of softwares which in fact they ship the Linux kernel along with other components. So they share the same kernel but with the different components. The last type of open source project is standalone document project. These items usually do not ship as part of an open source software package. The Linux documentation, for example, projects hosts many such projects that document various aspects of the GNU Linux operating systems. So those are the types of open source projects. We have libraries, distributions, and standalone document projects. We have open source software development methods. We have a number of open source software development methods. As we know that it is very hard to run an open source project following traditional software development methods. For example, the waterfall model. Simply because these traditional methods do not allow to go back to previous phase. As for waterfall model, after requirements have been gathered, then you move to analysis phase, then you move to design phase without allowing you to go back to change the previous phases. So in open source software, developments requirements are rarely gathered. In fact, speaking of open source software development, we don't normally gather requirements. So they are rarely gathered before the start of the project, but instead, these open source software developments, they are based on early releases of the software product. So as a software development, as a software developer, you first release a working software. Then from there, people start working on the existing software. So methods such as rapid prototyping, methods such as incremental and evolutionary development, methods such as spiral life cycle, rapid application development, and extreme programming can be applied to open source software development. Speaking of extreme programming, this is a very important development methods in open source software. In fact, extreme program is a type of agile software development, and normally it is intended to improve quality of software, and it improves also responsiveness to changing customer requirements. This kind of software methods advocates frequent releases in short development cycles. While it is intended to improve productivity, and it introduces what we call checkpoints at which new customer requirements can be adopted. So agile methods are very important, especially extreme programming. Extreme programming has a number of elements that makes it a suitable method for open source development. In extreme programming, you can do what we call you can program in pairs, or you can do what we call a coding extensively. There is what we call code review. You can do unit testing of all codes. And in fact, it's not programming features until they are needed. You cannot program certain features using extreme programming unless they are needed. And there is a flat management structure. So those are the most important elements of extreme programming that make them suitable. In fact, more generally, all agile programming methods are applicable to open source software development simply because of their interactive and iterative and incremental characters. So simply because they are interactive, simply because they are iterative, simply because they are incremental, then they are the suitable methods that we can use or we can apply while we are doing open source software development. But in open source software development, there are a number of tools that can be used to facilitate the development process. The first important tool is a communication channel. Developers and users of open source software projects, they normally require some electronic means of communication, simply because they are always often not necessarily working on the same project proximity. They can be distributed all over the world. So they need a communication channel which is electronic means. Such example of such channels can be email. Email can be a choice. Often electronic mailing lists are the ones that are used to make sure that mail messages are delivered to all interested parties at once. So we are not using just emails, but we create what we call mailing lists. These mailing lists, they will ensure that each and every person that is needed for that project receives mail messages and they are delivered at once. To communicate in real time, many projects use what we call instance messaging methods. Some can use the existing instant messaging messages such as WhatsApp. They create groups, etc., and they can communicate there as their communication channel. Some can use what we call web forums, and these recently have become a common way for different users to get help with the problems that they encounter while using open source projects. We will see in the coming videos different healthcare open source softwares, the forums that are for open source software that are used in healthcare organizations. Another forum in communication channels are the use of wikis. These also have become a common communication medium for developers and users. Another important tool in open source development is, and this is very important, the version control system. In open source software development, participants who are mostly volunteers are normally distributed among different geographical regions. So there is a need to have a tool to aid these participants to collaborate in the development of source code. So speaking of version control system is a very important tool that is needed to facilitate collaboration in the development of open source. For example, we have what we call concurrent versions control version system. In fact, this is an example of a source code collaboration tool that is being used in most of the open source software projects. It helps to manage the files and codes of the project when several people are working on the same project at the same time. It allows several people to work on the same file at the same time. So you can code as you are coding, another one codes at the same time. This is done by moving the file into the users directories, and then they merge the files into the users directories, and then merging these files when users are done. It also enables a user to easily retrieve a previous version of a file. So if you have made changes to the previous version of a file, then this control version, concurrent version control system, can help you to go back to the previous version of the file. Concurrently, many of these open source projects, they have changed from using just control version systems, and they have created what we call distributed revision control systems. In fact, these are they are much way better than the other control version systems. They Those other versions, the control version systems, they centralized what we call repositories. They are centralized. So now we have what we call distributed revision control systems. Example of such distributed revision control systems are like Git, which is used by the Linux kernel. We have Mercurial, that is used by Python program. That is another tool for open source development. The third tool is bug trackers and task lists. As we know that most large scale projects require a bug tracking system. This is in order to keep track of the status of the various issues in the development of the project. So a bug tracker is very important. We have several examples of bug trackers. For example, we have what we call Bugzilla. This is a web bug tracker for Mozilla. We have Mantis bug tracker. It's a web-based tracker for PHP and MySQL. We have what we call SourceForge, and it provides a bug tracker as part of its services. It tracks several bugs as results. Many projects that are hosted in this SourceForge, they are also tracked. Another tool that we need for open source development is a testing and debugging tool. Since open source software projects normally undergo frequent integration of source codes, so tools that help to automate the testing during system integrations are very important and they are very needed. For example, we have what we call a tinderbox. A tinderbox, in fact, enables participants in an open source software to detect errors during system integration. As you are integrating your system, then it is very easy to detect any errors that arise. This tinderbox normally runs a continuous building process, and it informs users about the parts of source code that have issues and on which platform these issues have risen. Another thing is a debugger. In fact, a debugger is a computer program that is used to debug, and sometimes it is used to test or to optimize other programs. For example, we have a debugger called GNU debugger. Is an example of debugger that is used in open source software development, and it offers remote debugging, which makes it a more suitable tool for open source software development. The last tool that we need while we are doing open source development is a package management. A package management system is a collection of tools that automate the process of installing, the process of upgrading, the process of configuring and removing software packages from a computer. For example, we have what we call Red Hat Package Manager. Is an important tool for packaging of open source software. Let's move on now. Let's talk about how we can host open source project. the most powerful and secure and the most popular online platform for hosting open source software project and for version control is GitHub. Is GitHub. It's the very important and most popular software. Is a most popular platform for hosting open source software. It uses a version control called Git. It uses a version control called Git, and in fact, speaking of Git, is a free and open source platform which is very fast, and it has what we call distributed version control system, which by design is based on speed, is based on efficiency, performance, and even data integrity to support, let's say, small scale to extensive software development projects. Git, in fact, is a software repository that allows you to keep a track of your software changes. You can even revert to previous version, and you can create another version of the files and the directories. In the coming videos, I will be explaining how you can install this Git, how you can do a lot of things using Git. In fact, Git is written using a C program with a mix of Perl and a variety of shell scripts, and primarily it was intended to run on a Linux kernel, and it has a number of remarkable features. Git is easy to use. It is highly efficient. It supports data integrity. It enables what we call cheap local branching. It offers convenient staging area, and it can also maintain multiple workflows together with many other features. So that is Git. But there are other platforms where you can host your open source projects. Simply that we know that recently Microsoft has reported that he wants to acquire GitHub. So many open source enthusiasts like me, we are worried. Maybe after Microsoft has acquired this platform, then we know that Microsoft is a for-profit company. So then we can have other platforms that we can host our open source projects. These are a kind of alternatives for GitHub. We have platforms like GitLab, we have Bitbuckets, we have Beanstalk, we have Launchpad, we have SourceForge, we have Gitbucket, we have Gogs, we have Gitea, we have Apache, Alula, and so many others. So it is up to you, a open source software developer, that you want to become an open source software developer. Those are the platforms where you can launch, you can host your open source project. So thank you very much for listening to this video. Thank you very much for subscribing to our channel. Please stay there. There are a lot to come. Share these videos with your fellow. If you are a student, share this video to your fellow students. If you are open source developer or a new open source developer, please stay there. There are a lot to come about open source development and other issues. So thank you very much. This is Elimika Mtandaoni.